When you told people, yeah, we're a ska band from Wyoming, like, what did people say?
The comedy answer is, where's Wyoming, or is that even a place?
Right?
And the second reaction is, what is ska?
Even when I explain it to them, they're still just like, I don't know what you're talking about.
How can you have a ska band from Wyoming?
Dude's like, so, like, what do you guys do? Oh, we're a ska band, whatever. He's like, oh, what's that? And this guy was, obviously a metalhead. They're like, it's like Metallica with horn. Oh, that sounds awesome.
Do you remember Sublime or Save Ferris or Real Big Fish? In the late 90s through the early 2000s, bands from Southern California, or at least other densely populated places, flooded the country with a mix of punk-sounding guitars and horns. But there were a few places across the U.S. where the wave hadn't exactly permeated the soil.
To me, ska-core is just the 50-50 blend of punk rock and ska,
On this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, in which we interview everyday people about things that don't normally happen every day, I interview 6 guys from small towns in Wyoming who became the home team for anyone who might not have had any other kind of home team on the cold, windy plains of Laramie, Wyoming.
There's just an inherent thing about it that wants to get you up and bouncing,
We were going to get your attention, whether you wanted to listen to us or not.
In 1999, I was a freshman at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. I either found or was handed a flyer for a show that night that was going to be capped off by the Ataris. I had heard the Ataris off of a compilation CD before, but there were 3 other bands that were also supposed to open up for them that night. The first band was actually composed of other students going to the college, and this is what I heard. That is Charlie Pathetic. Part of my dad's military career had led him from the college where I was now studying all the way down to Riverside County, California, where punk rock and ska had both become somewhat top-heavy with rules and elitists. But here on a cold night in the basement of UW's Student Union, one of the kids wearing a cowboy hat held up his horn and ripped the audience apart. It's kind of like getting to interview your heroes, Joe.
I think there's a saying that says, you should never meet your heroes, so boy, you're really messing up on that front.
That's Joe Mankin, the singer and guitarist.
I mean, I got my first guitar when I was probably 13 or 14. And I was born and raised in Gillette, Wyoming, which is country kind of a place, like in a rancher sort of a way. You had cowboy kids, if you will. If you take the Wayback Machine to the early 90s, there's no internet. The only lifeline I really had to music was MTV. Your only options for buying music is Walmart or Kmart or Columbia House, 10 for a penny, if you remember those.
It sounds pretty bleak, but in the early 1990s, after Nirvana got big, but then met their untimely end, punk bands began to surface on mainstream media and had even reached Joe and Gillette.
Green Day and The Offspring are just like rocketing in exposure. And then, ska bands are just are part of like that mosaic that's coming out at the time, And so the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones and No Doubt and Sublime, those kind of bands finally were being kind of getting some exposure, or at least getting pushed into the spotlight a little bit.
Like, I had a purple mohawk from like 9th grade on.
That's Ed Hayes, who would go on to be the band's bassist. He was also growing up in Gillette at the same time.
I had a pierced nipple that I played football with, just stupid stuff like that. Like I intentionally went out of my way to not fit in.
In Evanston, Wyoming, the exact opposite corner of the state, Justin Parks, who would become the group's trombonist, was starting his journey towards music that was farther and farther from the grain.
So my gateway into punk was Green Day, like many other people, when Dookie came out. And then that kind of led into Blink-182. But then I had a good friend of mine growing up. He got into ska when, Real Big Fish, and Sell Out came out, and Mighty Mighty Boss Tones and stuff like that.
My musical preferences, I was a metalhead.
That's Dan Walker, who grew up in Laramie and would go on to become Charlie Pathetic's drummer.
But I heard Less Than Jake, and it was like this driving, edgy, heavier rock and roll with horns behind it. And I was like, that is amazing. So I kind of gravitated toward that.
So what is ska?
The simplistic version of it is that it's just sped up reggae.
In a nutshell, thousands of miles from the windswept plains of Wyoming, Jamaican musicians in the 1950s combined calypso with American jazz and a walking bass line, and then it was accented with rhythms on the offbeat.
The beat is emphasized on the offbeats, like the upstrokes of everything, where most people count this 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, in between those is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3. All those ands in between are the thing that kind of gives it its bounce.
Eventually, after having a second wave in the 1970s and 80s, mostly associated with England, the third wave of ska broke across the U.S. during the 1990s.
But again, this Wyoming kid from the 90s living in the sticks doesn't know any of that or cares. It was just one of the things that I was just trying to fervently learn playing by ear. I never had official lessons on guitar at the time anyways. The way that I survived the social construct that is high school was I was always just putting together bands to put myself out as much as I could in a very like P.T. Barnum kind of a way, like prom and graduation and homecoming things. Like I would put together a band and we were going to play, Nirvana songs or punk rock songs even by that time.
Joe survived high school and ended up at the University of Wyoming, where he met up again with Ed, the bassist.
We got to go bigger, right? Like how do I go from being high school dude in band to college dude in band? And, in the late 90s, every one of those frat houses on that frat row was blaring Sublime out of their windows. And I was just like, if we're going to get into those parties and drink their beer and hang out with all the girls that are in there, we better start learning some Sublime covers fast. And fortunately, a lot of those had trumpet parts and horn parts. Ed was the one that got Dan roped in.
I had known Dan, our drummer, and Eli since probably band camp, junior high.
I got invited to play in the band because I was friends with Eli and Ryan Rada.
That's Alex Edel, who played baritone sax.
They're like, hey, you want to be in a band? I was like, sure. And, I had no idea what kind of music it was.
Justin, the trombone guy from Evanston, actually got invited to audition.
So I stayed at my buddy's house, and I remember there was all these amplifiers everywhere. I was like, what's with all this? He's like, oh, my roommate's in a band, in a ska band. And I was like, oh, that's cool. If they're ever looking for a trombone player, have them hit me up. A couple weeks later, I got a call from Joe. Being like, hey, man, I hear you play trombone. We're looking for a trombone player. And then, of course, just me playing horns growing up, it was my only opportunity to actually be in a semi-cool band.
Dan was from Laramie, and he had grandparents that lived in Laramie that had a house with a basement, and God bless them, they let us rehearse down in their basement, which had to have been an awful racket. But they never seemed to mind. That was really nice of them.
So how did this new and only ska-core band in the whole state get shows?
I think Ed was working in the music department at the time, like booking shows like with the university. So he had kind of his ear to the ground on how like getting shows would work. And then I was always like poking my nose in at like student council meetings or whatever to find the low hanging fruit to be like, hey, like you need a show. Like there was a lot of like street hustle because me being the showman was like, book the show first. We'll worry about the songs later kind of a thing. And so we did get those frat shows booked and just sort of minor shows before we even had figured out what we were even doing.
I remember the rugby team really liked us, and they'd want us to play for like 3 hours, but we only had like an hour set. So we'd kind of stretch it out, take a 30-minute break, and then just play the same thing again, but nobody cared.
And then at that point, I started seriously like trying to write our own songs so that every song that I wrote was a cover song that could be crossed off. I was an RA in Whitehall.
RAs were resident assistants. Basically, for the cost of room and board, they sort of kept an eye on the kids living in the dorms.
You always had to do like desk shifts as part of your duty there. And so I always took the late night 2 a.m. ones because no one ever showed up except for, staggering drunken kids like coming home in the middle of the night. You got to sign the book or whatever. And so that was my woodshedding time. Like I was just there with a guitar trying to come up with these songs, garbage songs, but it didn't matter because we just needed content.
It was mostly Joe writing the music out on a a note paper. Joe would never give us sheet music. He would literally just like whatever notes we were supposed to play, he'd just write E, B, C, D, or whatever it was. And then he'd demonstrate on the guitar, and then so we could get the rhythm of it, and then we would play it.
Like most of our songs are about heartache and girls. That's a very Wyoming thing. Oh, this girl broke up with me. Oh, this girl sucks. Oh, I suck. Oh, I suck because this girl thinks I suck.
A lot of those songs are all very wah wah, like, oh, what was me? Why don't I have a girlfriend? Or like, or the flip side, like, I've got a girlfriend and she's driving me nuts. Like, those are like the only two flavors of songs in there. And I just listen to it and just cringe.
I think that kind of came with the territory. I don't think you have anything to feel bad about. Aren't a lot of songs often about love or crushes or having your heart broken or all three?
That was my escape valve. This is Charlie Pathetic. That's on brand. It's supposed to be like the lament of the 20-year-old loser.
One of the songs Joe wrote was called Punk Rock Beauty Queen.
Yeah, and I always thought it was Punk Rock Beer Queen. Maybe you changed the lyrics at some point too. Joe didn't change it. I just misheard him. Here it is.
That's how it goes, 'cause she's my punk rock beauty queen, and you think that she owns the entire scene, but she's been screaming all since she was 3, 'cause she's my punk rock beauty queen, alright.
I didn't know who she was. Might have been like my second show. Was at that frat house that we'd done a couple of shows at.
Yeah.
And I ended up like dancing with this girl, and then a couple of the guys afterwards were like, hey, that's actually the Punk Rock Beauty Queen. She didn't look punk, but she was super into punk music and stuff, but she didn't look like a typical punk rock girl at all.
So how did they get the name Charlie Pathetic?
HBO had come out with a movie about the Rat Pack. One of the guys was talking to the other one. It's like, I'm going to show up Charlie John Wayne all strapped with guns and bang, 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 shoot the place up. And when they talked about how they were going to do something, it was Charlie whatever. Joe and I were like walking between like house parties to start the year because like neither one of us had a car that was running at that point, And I was like, we're pretty Charlie Pathetic at this point, Less Than Jake being one of our influences. It kind of vibed with that. And it kind of fell into place as far as that went.
I asked the band to describe what their shows were like.
It was always out of control goofiness. People would be jumping and dancing.
Chaos and having fun. That was always the goal.
Joe would even do like little disclaimers like, hey, moshing is fine, but let's not hurt each other. Let's all be kind.
Would they cuss at him from the audience, or were they like, yeah, whatever?
Both. I don't know how much they listened to the lyrics at first. After a while, people would sing along.
I thought there was a time all the band members wrote their names on ping pong balls and threw them out in the audience, and we were supposed to throw the ping pong balls at that guy, with his name on it.
I don't know what we were thinking as far as that went. I think that was just like how to get people interacting. Being the bass player, I stood in the back, so I didn't really have much to deal with that. I know our sax players didn't love that idea.
I also remember at least one or two of the saxophone guys having to stop and shake the ping pong balls out of their horns.
Probably not our finest idea, but I'm sure we had more than a couple of those.
Joe, he had to do all the talking and all the singing, so he would run out of breath. You start to pass out and you see stars, right? He would call them pterodactyls. Like when you see stars and like, oh man, I don't have enough oxygen, he would say, I'm seeing pterodactyls. And so then we knew that was when things were going good, and everyone was just pumped and jumping and dancing, and that was the cool part.
Charlie Pathetic describes the difference between playing in the college town of Laramie versus one of their crazier shows 2 hours to the north in Casper, Wyoming.
Like in the student union, we were playing for college kids that just sort of wandered in going like, what the heck is this, right? Casper had a much more punk rock scene.
We played a show with One Man Army.
And we were wrecking it. People started crowd surfing and kicking out ceiling tiles.
The management was like, hey, can you tell the kids to stop like kicking out the ceiling tiles because those are expensive. People were going so ape. It may not have been intentional. Like, it was just like, well, there was nowhere to go. Like, once you're on top of everybody's heads, you're going through the ceiling. I don't know what to tell you. Those were falling left, right, and center because of just the chaos that was happening in the place that we were playing at there. And so I remember thinking, like, well, we must be doing something right because the ceiling is literally coming down and the people that own this place are not happy.
Kids were flailing all over the place and feet in the air. And I've never been in an earthquake, but I bet you that's what it was like.
Yeah, that was pretty crazy to see kids reacting to something that you're doing in that sort of way. That was definitely one of the cooler moments.
By this time, Charlie Pathetic had 8 or 9 members, and I remember, even at 18 years old, wondering how they could all get along and agree on anything.
It's hard to coordinate a band with 3 or 4 people in it, trying to make plans with, how many, I think there was 8 of us.
That's Eli Zabadi, who also played sax.
Getting everybody together for rehearsals and shows and all of that was a lot of work.
I was herding cats at all times, and I mean that in the most loving way, too. Like, the band was so important to me, and it was such my baby that if all of a sudden, like, everyone was just like, we're not feeling it with this guy, then it came to me to be like, sorry, dude, you're out.
Say a member of the band needed to not be there anymore, we did that.
Those were painful moments to have to do, but at the same time, like, I was just eye on the prize. Like, when you have that many people in the band, like, eventually what ends up happening is I become kind of a benevolent overlord is probably the nicest way to put it.
One of the coolest things about Charlie Pathetic's drive and dedication was that it went beyond music to hosting a new venue for bands in Laramie.
So we started renting like this industrial garage that was down there by the train tracks as our rehearsal place and just a place to like leave our crap, because we had so much stuff.
There was like this crazy death metal band, Yog Sothoth, that we shared it with, and they were like nocturnal or something, so we never really had issues like coordinating practices around it.
And then eventually it just became like, well, why don't we just have the shows here? And there was like a mini mart that was next door that like boarded up, and they like stripped the sign down and just chucked it into the trash heap, and somebody ran over there. We yanked the mini part of the mini mart sign off and just hung it above the door and said, there you go, a venue is formed.
There was this website called garageband.com, and we would find people that were traveling and book shows at the mini. And
so the next thing you know, we had bands showing up. We had oil can fires out front because a lot of times it was snowing. And it's just like you charge like $5 at the door, and everybody would just pack into that garage. And there was no stage. Like, you were face to face with your audience 6 inches away. And every band that we ever put in there loved it because it was just like, this is kind of what we signed up for. The crowd was just packed in there with you. And I think a lot of people were just like, this is it. This is punk rock.
Like, the cops would come by, and, as long as nobody was, obviously drinking underage, like, we kind of just got left alone.
And it just became this thing where it's like, we can get bands in here and we'll open for them every time, of course, but we'll treat them like kings when they're here, and hopefully they'll reciprocate.
And give them some gas money, place to sleep, shower, laundry, food, and we just always tried to be decent to everybody that was decent to us.
In addition to working with booking websites and publications, some of the bands that came to Laramie still got their booking the old-fashioned way. Justin talks about going to see the Ataris in Denver and what happened there.
And me and my friends before the show were just walking. I think we were walking to get something to eat or something, kind of out in front of the venue. And then I'm like, pretty sure those guys are in the Ataris just walking down the street. And so I remember it was Mike, their bass player for sure. And I can't remember who else was there, probably their drummer. And I was like, hey, we came down from Wyoming to see you guys, which a lot of people, they don't know where Wyoming is. So they thought we went on this crazy epic journey to get down there, and it was like less than 2 hours. But like, oh my gosh, you guys came down all the way from Wyoming to see us? Like, yeah. They were like, you guys should play Laramie sometime, just again, kind of being sarcastic. And they were like, actually, yeah, here's our agent. If you contact our agent, we would love to play up there. I'm like, oh, okay. Cool. So got back to Laramie, called. The guy actually returned my call, and we set up the show.
And that, along with funding from the University of Wyoming, is how I ended up seeing the Ataris that one night in Laramie, but was totally blown away by Charlie Pathetic.
We're running our own venue at 20 years old. We're signing contracts and dealing with professional musicians, and their agents and all sorts of nonsense, stuff that like we didn't have any experience doing. We're just kind of making it up as we went, booking out the arcade pool hall, for shows as we got bigger and kind of outgrew our spaces, and signing all of those contracts and putting myself on the line and trying to figure out how to like market a show to the point where at least breaks even. So got a lot of practical knowledge out of things like that.
The networking Charlie Pathetic learned to do led to an important connection with a recording studio in Lafayette, Indiana.
You may have heard this band, the Lillingtons. They were out of Newcastle. We had befriended them. They had recorded quite a few of their albums at the Sonic Iguana, and Tim, the drummer of the Lillingtons, kind of put in a good word by connecting us with them. And we were just like, well, we would like to make one album, please. And they were just like, sure, come on out. So now we're booked at the Sonic Iguana now. We're going to go make our record, and this is going to be the best. This is going to catapult us into fame and fortune,
We really kind of looked at that as our big opportunity.
Before Charlie Pathetic could make the 1,100-mile, 16-hour journey from Laramie, Wyoming to Lafayette, they had to find something that could hold all of them and their equipment.
My dad called me up and he's like, hey, you guys need a bus? And I was like, all right. He's like, well, I bought one, but you got to go to Idaho and pick it up. And I was like, all right.
Some sort of like prepper dude or something bought it like as his like Mad Max, I'm going to prepare for the end of the world kind of vehicle.
Basically, this bus had just been like sitting as like somebody's storage unit. It was full of like mice and all sorts of stuff. He's like, oh, and you're going to need to clean it out. We all got back from that trip sick as dogs, thinking that we probably picked up like hantavirus.
And we built like bunk beds in there. And then we built like a wooden storage thing that just like held all of our gear. And then we wired that baby up with like a second battery to run the TV with like the PlayStation or whatever.
You know how the Partridge Family had a hand-painted school bus? Picture a bus like that, but bright orange with logos of people playing horns and smashing guitars, and you'd sort of get the idea.
Right. And so there was this big moment where all of the girlfriends and everybody are there to watch us like pile into this clown car bus. And we head eastbound, top speed at like 45 miles an hour or whatever.
I think we were really determined to make something happen there.
Oh, we're going to get this record cut, and, somebody's going to hand it off to the right person, and, we're instantly rock stars or something.
And we make it into Nebraska, like crossing into the Nebraska line, and then something just explodes.
So I remember I was sleeping, and then all of a sudden I just hear all this racket, just all this smoke coming from the front of the bus, black gunk everywhere in the engine.
Yeah, we were just broken down on the side of the Nebraska interstate at like 1 a.m, just going like, okay, so now what? And yeah, eventually a truck driver dude like pulled over because they saw us with the hazards, and they were like, well, I can take you to Ogallala, which was like the next town into Nebraska. And we were like, well, Dan's got to record first because we were going to be doing the drums first. And so he took his like drum pedal and his drumsticks, and I grabbed my guitar, got in this dude's semi, while all the rest were just like, well, we're just gonna go to sleep.
Not a lot of thinking involved. Don't ever plan on breaking down on I-80 at 2 a.m. in the middle of nowhere.
We decided Ryan and Ed were going to stay behind and get the bus towed or whatever they needed to do.
And so I'm just like, well, I don't know. I hope we see you guys there. We're going to get there and we're going to start, because we had to be there like Tuesday or whatever. And it was like, here we were Sunday night. We're going to make it somehow. He took us into Ogallala. And of course, at this time I have bright green hair, like we are a ragged crew showing into this like truck stop at like 6 a.m. We were able to go to the Greyhound station, finally opened up, and we were able to like buy Greyhound tickets to take the Greyhound to like Chicago from Nebraska. And then from there, we'll figure out how to get to Lafayette, Indiana. Meanwhile, while this is happening, the next morning, the cops have shown up at the bus, and Ed probably filled you in on his half of the story, where I think they towed it in to some wrecking place.
From there, the guys who'd stayed with the tour bus rented a van.
And they loaded that minivan to the gills with all of our gear that we had in the back of the bus. Now they're driving.
Joe and the other guys who went with the trucker and then bought bus tickets to Chicago made it as far as Omaha before calling the guys who'd rented the van. Luckily, one of the van guys had a cell phone at the time.
We're in Omaha. Where the heck are you? And they're just like, we just passed Omaha. We're in a rental van. And it was just like, turn around and come get us. And so they showed up there at the Greyhound station in Omaha. And like, I was never happier to see anyone in my entire life. But now there's the new problem in that they weren't expecting to pick up 4 more passengers carrying their gear. They had already had like a packed to the gills van. And somehow we just all wedged in there. In the most like ridiculous, unsafe Tetris blob of humanity and instruments all laying on each other in a dog pile. And I think we maybe showed up like a half a day late, but we rolled in there and then just immediately started tracking that album. And it was just like one of those things where it's like I hadn't slept in like 3 days. And it was just like, let's go. I don't care. Because I think there's maybe 10 or 12 songs on that we did over the course of like 5 days.
After finishing their tracks, Joe asked the guys at the studio what the next step was.
He was asking those guys, like, now what's next, like kind of like expecting that we were just going to like get signed to a record label and get booked on a tour. And they're like, I don't know, dude, like you take it and you go do whatever with it. We ended up sending it out to record labels. We actually got like not bad responses, but nobody outright signed us.
We had this huge wave of momentum until we recorded, but we probably only played a handful of shows after we had a CD. We were never on a label, and we're all kind of like at the end of college and trying to figure out next steps in life. People were starting to like get engaged, and I was graduating. I think Ryan and Parks were both graduating.
Yeah, everything just kind of fell apart at that point, and everybody sort of went different ways. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, I definitely wanted it to continue. I was all about giving it a shot, getting on the road on a tour across a lot of states to kind of see how good we could make it,
I think it would have just taken more time. I mean, we were only together for a couple years in all, and most bands don't make it in just a couple years.
It crushes me to think about this, but one thing Charlie Pathetic was also facing, despite their rugged level of commitment as musicians, was the fickle level of attention of listeners.
That ska scene like burned bright fast, and then it was just gone.
It had a real short window where it was cool on MTV.
I asked Joe what he did after the band and graduation.
Oh, graduate, you say? Well, here's what happened. I was doing electrical engineering for the first year, and then that was really hard. So second year, I switched to physics, but Charlie Pathetic at this point had now become my focal point with kind of college as the backdrop of like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be going to my geology lab right now, but oh well. And then I dropped out. I was back in Gillette working in the coal mine. At some point, I thought I was going to be able to make a career out of this. I'm like, that's a hilarious joke, college ska band, like this is the lowest form of music. For me, it's tough for me to listen to that album only because, it's like, you imagine what your journal of you is like a 19-year-old.
I wouldn't have gone out of my way to stalk you guys and like try to make contact and put you on a podcast if I didn't genuinely enjoy it and think it had validity and importance, at least in my life. Please stop feeling bad. I thought it was cool.
Well, thank you.
I asked the guys what their takeaways were from their time in the band.
So when we sent out some press kits to record labels before we went our separate ways, we actually got responses.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was, if you go on tour on your own with your own money and you don't kill each other, we'll talk. I kept a lot of friendships, which was just a special thing.
What Dan says about friendships reminds me of what he would do when I would see him working at the cafeteria at the college.
I swear, I think, Dan, I have memories of you with like maybe a hat or a hairnet or something and an ice cream scoop serving mashed potatoes. And you were always cool to me. Like, you're always like, hey, we got a show. And you would always personally invite me. I was like, heck yeah.
You're welcome. And I tried to do that with everyone.
The reason why I wanted to thank Dan was because although punk rock might have been about tearing down the rules, where I'd just come from, it seemed like a lot of them had made up a lot of their own rules and could be very intolerant if you didn't have the right look or listen to the right bands. Here are Ed's reflections about being in the band.
Everybody's got the rock star fantasies of like, gosh, I if only I could have done that. But I also think that like everything's got a window, right? I don't want to be the guy that's hanging on to, something for too long. Do I wish the band could have done more? Absolutely. Do I wish that my life would have turned out differently? Not really, no. I went back to school, got an MBA, ended up working with money.
2 other guys of the 6 I interviewed also ended up working in finance or accounting.
Yeah, so I do the least punk thing possible, which is I work with investments at a credit union, working for the man.
I'm going to assume that you know a lot about investments then.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is any band really a safe investment, at least until they have,
No,
a
not at
following?
all. Yep, it. Most of them don't pan out. That's for sure.
Speaking of money, I asked Ed what happened with that giant credit card bill he'd incurred to help pay for the band's studio time in Indiana.
That ended up being paid off some years later, not by a band.
I found myself asking Eli a question that has gone through my mind more and more in recent years, but really only came to the surface as I realized these guys, who were students and cafeteria employees by day, but ceiling tile crushing ska heroes by night, were turning out to be more and more like me and all the other people who suddenly find themselves in their 40s, not exactly living rock star lifestyles.
How did we get old? And is it okay to grow up and move on? And
Like I had my fill, like I went to that well and drank from it enough times that, maybe I'm good. I don't know that I do very well, like traveling around in a band anymore. Like sleeping somewhere different every night sounds like a lot of hard work. Seems less fun a second time or a third time or a fourth time.
Ed also weighs in on this.
I was certainly more willing to put myself in a wild situation than I am now in my mid-40s,
Alex, the Barry Sachs guy, who was also a finance guy, broke my heart when he told me this.
I started having a lot of problems playing the saxophone, actually. Every time I would try to play, my jaw would kind of shoot off to the left.
During Alex's senior year, he was diagnosed with focal dystonia, a neurological condition that causes muscle spasms, in this case in his jaw, which even today prevents him from playing his sax. He still wanted to share this about his time in Charlie Pathetic.
I was pretty shy and quiet, being on a stage and and playing music for 50 or 60 kids. It's not a very big audience, but still, it helped me get more confidence and being comfortable in front of people.
So what happened to Joe, the guitarist and vocalist?
And I went to recording school in Phoenix, Arizona. And so I did move to LA, and I did work in like a major label recording studio. People that were my heroes my entire life. I was now, I was getting them their coffee and their cigarettes as a runner initially. But I mean, I was just like, okay, here you go, Tom Morello, here's your lunch, and like, it was bananas. Like all of these bands that I just was like, they really are here in LA.
Joe eventually got involved in legal research and now works as a paralegal.
I still never stopped writing songs. I still have, like even where I'm sitting right now, there's 2 guitars and a bass, like within arm's distance at all times, and notebooks of me continuously writing things. So it never stopped. Creative people are just going to create. Like, would you do your podcast knowing like that it's not going to get 100,000 views?
Joe is very kind, but greatly overestimating the size of my audience, as well as how big of an anticipated listener count I really need before I get excited about some story and do an episode on it.
There's something in you that says like, this is my thing, and I'm just doing it. And if one person listens to it, or 20 people or 2,000 people, that doesn't matter. Like, you're still going to do your thing. Like, you want to make something for your audience, but if no one hears it, that's not the point of why you made it, I guess, is where I'm coming from,
The band shares their final thoughts.
Not everybody gets to be a part of something like that. Even, if it's just a handful of people that care and remember, like, you remember and you care enough to talk to us. So
for what it's worth, it's like, this random guy who came to some of your shows and thought you were so cool, like went out of his way. Is it 24 years, 25 years? A long time later has gone out of his way to like try to get a hold of you and put you on a podcast. And I hope it's some sort of tribute to the impact you guys had.
It was just one of those things where you just had to be there at that time.
I can say it is the time period that I look back on with the most fondness.
I think at that age, the danger is part of the fun. Like, is the bus going to break down? Who knows? Are we going to make it?
For 19 to 21-year-old people, I am amazed at the level of commitment that we had.
You want greatness, sometimes you got to reach for it, and it doesn't always happen. So it's okay.
It was just fun being on a stage and having people come and having be excited about it. It was fun. It was good.
I'd like to thank Ryan Rada and Brandon Seaman, who also played in Charlie Pathetic, but who I haven't been able to make contact with. I'd also like to thank all of the other members of Charlie Pathetic who you heard on the show today. If you would like to hear more Charlie Pathetic or learn more about them, please visit charliepathetic.com. I'll link it in the description. I'll also link a playlist of all of their songs from their album Recount. Some of the songs from it were on the show today. Shout out to KHOL and Jackson for playing this show. If you've enjoyed the show, please do a search for That Doesn't Happen Every Day. Every day is 2 words in this case. Podcast. And you can listen to every past episode I've ever done completely for free. Thank you for listening. I hope to have a new episode to you in about 2 weeks.